from Freedom, a member of the Friends of Danforth Association. And we're looking for more members. If anyone would like to join up, please leave your name on one of the sign-in sheets at the back. But it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Amanda McQuaid. Dr. McQuaid holds a PhD in biological sciences from the University of New Hampshire. You couldn't ask for a better person to speak on this topic. Currently, Amanda is the director of the Lade Lakes Monitoring Program and state specialist in water quality and Ecotoxicology at UNH. You may be familiar with Amanda when she was with the state. She is the former Algal and Cyanobacteria bloom program coordinator for the state of New Hampshire, Department of Environmental Services. So Amanda, I thank you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you all for being here today on a beautiful Friday morning, afternoonish. I'm really pleased to be here, and thank the Friends of Danforth Pond and Green Mountain Conservation Group really for getting this together today. I'm not new to the University of New Hampshire. I did get my degrees there, but it's great to be back with the Lakeside Monitoring Program, and being a state specialist in water quality and ecotoxicology is really about the cyanobacteria toxicity. So I will talk a lot about cyanobacteria today, but I also will bring up some of the important work that you guys are all doing in the region to protect the watershed and what you can do to continue that effort. So thanks again for having me here today. So, so I want to just start off, and let me know if you can't see anything, but probably on the way here too. But this is a good example to show that every lake is so unique, and it's hard to remember that. We can't compare Lake Winnipesaukee to the Danforth ponds. It's a totally different ecosystem, even though we like to just call them all lakes. And there's really no difference between a lake and a pond. It's just kind of more of a nomenclature. Aside from maybe some farm ponds, water bodies are part of watersheds. And it's really important that we understand the flow of water and the important contributing factors that create the water quality that we see and that we experience. And so the biggest thing that I think we could all agree on and talk about and understand is stormwater runoff. And effective rainfall is when there is a lot of growth, macrophytes, plants, trees, things that can absorb the flow of water from our rain. In more recent years, we are experiencing more extreme weather events, so we might have huge rainstorms followed by really hot sunny days, and that's sort of the perfect recipe for algal growth or cyanobacteria blooms. So the infographic on the right is what we would consider effective rainfall, where the rain comes down fast, it's absorbed quickly, and we slow the flow to our lakes. That is an effective rainfall. Non-effective is when we have grass and turf and not a very good root system to absorb all of that runoff and rain. And so we end up with more nutrients, salt, and pollution getting into our water bodies when we're not creating what we like to call buffer zones to our watersheds. So the description on the right is more descriptive of plants taking up the water before all those runoff nutrients, salts, pollution get into the water, and we want to have more of an effective rainfall in our watersheds. Up on the right, I just wanted to note the New Hampshire Homeowner's Guide to Stormwater Management, if you're not familiar with, is through New Hampshire DES. It's a great resource. It's sort of a user-friendly guide just to kind of evaluate your own property or the community to really hone in on stormwater management. I can't stress that enough. Stormwater management, not only for protecting us from not having blooms, is also protecting us from not getting persistent chemicals into the water. Other things are also harmful, not just cyanobacteria. The University of New Hampshire also has a great guide. This is through the Cooperative Extension. You can find it on our website. It's called Landscaping at the Water's Edge. It's a really nice illustrated guide on certain native shrubs that are useful, how to plant things, how to divert the flow of water coming directly off of your land into a waterway. The drawing on the right is not from this guide, but I thought it was a nice sort of illustration to show that when you have native plants, the root system is what's really important here. Compare all of these native shrubs to the turf lawn grass, you can see that we're really not having effective rainfall when we have a lot of grass and turf. Added to that is when we fertilize and we try to have the greenest lawns around. So grass is great, but if we have green lawns, you can think that we might also have green water, and that's something to just keep in mind, that these native shrubs are really, really useful in helping us divert the pollution going into the lakes. Another great guide is Soak Up the Rain with New Hampshire DES. You can find that at the website. There's also the Lake Smart Guide offered by the New Hampshire Lakes Organization, and if you live on the lake, you can be certified as a Lake Smart host, basically, that you are living on the lake and you're living lake friendly, lake smart, and you can go through a survey to kind of check yourself and work with New Hampshire Lakes on how to remediate any potential issues there might be. So I encourage you to look at these resources. They're really great, and you learn a lot too, and just have a great landscaped property from it probably as well. So the reason why we care, and this is why I'm talking today, is about the cyanobacteria. So this runoff, these nutrients, we're talking about phosphorus, nitrogen, some micronutrients like iron. There's a lot of different nutrients, just like we feed our gardens, are feeding our lakes, and cyanobacteria just loves this stuff. Cyanobacteria, though, are not truly algae. They're not truly plants, but they behave that way. They are photosynthetic bacteria. They're formerly known as blue-green algae. Some people still call them blue-green algae, so I'll talk about it in a minute, but you might even see blue-green algae as a label on some supplements and things in food products. So blue-green algae is the old term, but it's truly a photosynthetic bacteria. It's not actually algae. We just can't get over that name. So these photosynthetic bacteria can outcompete other algae because they're utilizing the sun's energy, but they also have their bacteria characteristics that can help them grow as well. So they really take advantage of these nutrients and usually tend to be the ones that bloom and outcompete the other algae. But they're nothing new. They've been, I'm not sure if you can read this, but they've been here since the beginning of time, really. They've been attributed to creating oxygen on the planet, actually, so they're not all bad. There's thousands of species, hundreds of toxins, and we're learning more and more about new toxicity all the time and finding new techniques so that we can measure them and understand how toxic they can actually be. They're ubiquitous, not just globally, they're virtually everywhere. They're in the soil, they're in the air, they're in the trees, they're on lichens. So it's not just a freshwater issue, it's also something you might see in the oceans. And so the reason why we are concerned about cyanobacteria again is because they are potentially toxic, and this is probably really hard to read, but basically we have two different sets of guidelines going for us right now. One is set by the EPA, which has identified two toxins as being dangerous for drinking water and recreation. So there are these loose guidelines and thresholds out there on how much toxins per volume in the lake might be a recreational hazard or drinking water hazard. But there's no federal regulation on these toxins. This is just a contaminant candidate so far. And there's just, again, hundreds of toxins. So we're only talking about a few that have the threshold for advisory purposes. In New Hampshire, we will issue advisories based on cell count because we recognize that there's just so many toxins that we can't measure them fast enough to get a full evaluation. We don't want to be overly cautious about it, but we also don't want to be laid back about it because we just want people to recognize cyanobacteria and try to avoid it because you can't tell how toxic a bloom is by looking at it. So cyanotoxins really are just these chemicals that cyanobacteria produce. They're considered secondary metabolites. Some produce these harmful toxins. Some actually produce other secondary metabolites that are being considered in cancer research. So again, not all bad. So there's a lot of things that we don't really understand or know about cyanobacteria, but it's a real hot topic in research because of the good and the bad secondary metabolites that they can produce. Cyanotoxins are named for the cyanobacteria, but not all of the cyanobacteria are toxic. Some can turn on their toxins at certain times that we don't fully understand. Sometimes one can produce more than one type of toxin, and other times they're just not toxic at all. And so toxic species may not always express toxicity. The bioaccumulation of toxins is also something that we're studying. This was part of my dissertation, was to look at the movement of toxins through the aquatic food web. So it's not just, that we would go and drink the lake or be exposed to it firsthand. There's also the accumulation of toxins through the food web to fish, to birds, that we should also be considering when we consider cyanobacteria toxicity. Right now, this is just a little photo basically of a well plate. We use this method called an enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay to do a quick test on toxins, but those assays are only available for a few of the toxins, and that's why we just know more about certain ones than we do about others. And just the other day, I read a new paper about a new toxin that they think is more prevalent and more toxic than all the other ones, and we couldn't measure it before. So again, I just caution you to, when you see it, just know that we can't tell how toxic these blooms are by looking at it. And it's probably way more complicated than I can explain today. But bottom line is that the health effects vary from skin irritations to death. That's like a wide range of what could happen. I don't want to say it's like COVID, but it affects people differently too. Why did one person get ill and the other person didn't? There's a risk factor when you're swimming. How much water do you swallow? For dogs, they go right for it, and they consume the lake, and then they'll groom themselves after. So really, our dogs are probably the most, vulnerable to the cyanobacteria blooms when they're in the water. But some of the more common ones that we have are microsystems. There's lots of different variants of this type of toxin. It can cause just like upset stomach, very similar to E. coli. So sometimes you might go swimming and you just feel like, oh, my stomach doesn't feel great. That could be E. coli, that could be microsystems, it could be a parasite, so we don't always tie in health effects with cyanobacteria blooms, and that's something that I think the United States is working on. There's a One Health system that is being developed to help people report illnesses related to cyanobacteria to the CDC, and that's called it's called One Health, and I can get you the link if you're interested, or if you ever feel that you might have been affected by a bloom, you can report it, and that can help us understand these incidences more readily. But I won't go through all of these. Just note that we do have a whole bunch of ones that are very well studied. The one I'm really concerned about is anatoxin. This is a very fast-acting toxin. It's been related to or compared to the most venomous snakes in the world. It has a very potent toxin that is very fast-acting. It can cause seizures and death within hours. This one is also extremely difficult to measure because it degrades so quickly. And so we don't have a very good handle on anatoxin in the United States or even globally. So there's really no guideline on what level is allowable. If we even had those guidelines for us, it would be really difficult to interpret because it's very hard to measure because of the degradation of this toxin. But it causes more of a nervous system failure, and that's something to really watch out for if a dog was to drink the water nearby. We would probably see the green water and be like, oh, I'm staying away from that. But, again, watch out for young kids and pets in these accumulation areas, even if it's just a small patch in the water. So I won't go through all of these, but just know that there is a whole range of these types of toxins. And so I mentioned the blue-green algae supplement thing, and I think it's just important to recognize the blue-green algae term, because these organisms that produce all these different toxins are also being bottled up into capsules and being sold commercially. They're not federally regulated, they're not FDA approved. There's even a big warning on them. I should have included a few photos. I went to the grocery store and found tons and tons of things that have blue-green algae in it. And namely spirulina, which you might not identify as cyanobacteria, but when you hear spirulina, you might have recognized that you went to get a smoothie once and they were offering, a little tablespoon of spirulina for $1 or something, and that's basically dried up cyanobacteria. And so there's just tons of these supplements that could be just one culture of spirulina that's not really known to be that toxic, but they're not testing the toxins, and again, we don't know all of the toxins that cyanobacteria may produce. One of the things that's up here I just noticed is Klamath. Sometimes there's this lake out, Klamath Lake out in Oregon, and they've really literally been like just harvesting the algae in the zooplankton and adding it to like kombucha drinks and just these various like health food things. And again, it's not to say that, oh, I'm gonna drink this and drop dead. It's more of just we don't understand like the chronic toxicity and how much you consume over time and how you are exposed to cyanobacteria. So if you can avoid it, maybe avoid supplements. I'm not saying do or do not, it's just something to be aware of, that blue-green algae, spirulina, or even just like Klamath Lake, you don't know really what's in that stuff, and some of these have really potent toxins. So just a warning on that. Just a funny story, I guess it's funny. When I was pregnant, I went to get prenatal vitamins, and I noticed that even in that, and at Target, it wasn't like some, like out, just some small store. It was Target, and it had vitamins that had blue-green algae in it. And another time, I was eating ice cream, and it was like a pistachio, and the green color was from cyanobacteria. And so again, it's not like all these things are gonna directly harm you. It's noteworthy that cyanobacteria is more than just a bloom on a lake. And so blooms, and blooms can really vary, and I'll go through a few of the more common types that we see. But more typically you see sort of like this like blue-green swirl near the beach, and the rest of the lake might be fine. This stuff is growing in the lake, coming up to the surface, and then it's more about the wind and the currents of where it ends up. So beaches, which I was part of the New Hampshire DES beach program, we would hear a lot of people complain that the beaches are covered in the blue-green algae. The rest of the lake is fine. Can we go somewhere else on the lake? And I would say yes. If you don't see this huge accumulation, the rest of the lake might be clear. It's just unfortunate when it does accumulate on our beaches where we want to hang out or on the shoreline. But it can look like a lot of different things. Like this just looks like pollen, but in fact it is cyanobacteria. Sometimes these organisms can kind of bond together in a way and accumulate and aggregate, and they have the same buoyancy as pollen. So you might actually see pollen mixed in with it, or a pollen layer right on top of it. So, don't always think, oh, it's just pollen, whatever. Just be mindful that this accumulation represents a lot of organisms. They could be even parasites and other harmful things that are accumulating and aggregating together. We also have these like black sort of benthic mats that will come up, and people might think that it's like oil or some like crazy substance, but it's also a deep water cyanobacteria mat that can come up and look very black, and just something to be noteworthy. You wouldn't necessarily think blue-green algae would probably be any other color, but it does present itself in a lot of different ways. So one good example, and this is one that I think is really fascinating, it's Gliotrichia, and it's in some of our biggest, deepest, cleanest lakes. So Gliotrichia, we see in Winnipesaukee, we see in some of the lakes around the Acton Wakefield area, like Great East Lake has had it, Level Lake. But it's also an organism that we don't know a lot about. We know that it can produce toxins, but at probably lower levels than some of the other cyanobacteria. These don't typically create that blue-green surface scum, so these kind of look like little dots in the water that you might think, oh, is this like an egg mass, or is that something interesting? With eutrophication, it can accumulate, especially towards Labor Day in Lake Winnipesaukee. So just another type to look out for. So nostoc, another one that doesn't truly form this like surface scum. Nostoc is like these little green marbles on the bottom of the lake. They look like these little blue-green orbs. It's kind of hard to see here, but all of those green patches are tiny little orbs of nostoc. That's a type of cyanobacteria. When you crack them open and really slice them up, you see that there's a lot of these like pink little cells inside, and each of those are toxic. So nostoc is intriguing because you might want to find it and play with it or something, but it's not going to create a surface bloom. You're not likely to accidentally ingest nostoc. However, we're learning that nostoc can also exist outside of these orbs. They can be sort of part of a mutual relationship or symbiotic relationship with some plants. Some of the other cyanobacteria have also been symbiotic with some plants, so this stuff can actually grow within the roots of cycad trees, and there's a really interesting study and connection and research looking at the people of Guam and how they're using the cycad tree and might be developing neurological symptoms from consuming the toxin produced by nostoc, just as it accumulates through the food web that they have in Guam. I will also say that nostoc is a delicacy in some countries, so they go out and harvest it and they add it to meals. So again, there's sort of a whole range of thoughts about cyanobacteria. Back to the black mat, we are seeing more of these black mats come up. In fact, Winnipesaukee, Spofford Lake, some of, again, the bigger, deeper, clean lakes that we think of that have very clear water, also probably have enough light to get down to the bottom where these mats are growing. And this can come up at times, usually from boat activity, just at the end of the summer after a lot of activity on the lake. They become dislodged from a rock or the bottom of the lake. And then lakes turn over in the fall, so sometimes this comes up in just huge mats that then beach themselves on the beach, basically. And they're just little tiny filaments that are intertwined and can be lots of different types of cyanobacteria. Stygosema is one that we're seeing a lot of, and we don't know them to be very toxic. Again, it's like, how much of this would you consume? Well, cattle tend to like it, and there's been lots of research showing that large animals like cattle and horses can die from consuming just even a little bit of this stuff. And then we're also just starting to see this other kind of strange color bloom in a few of our lakes, smaller systems. This Warrenachinia, we're not finding it to be very toxic, but really, like, what would you think if you showed up at the lake and the lake looked like that? That's truly the color. It was like this orange kind of, people thought it was paint, like what is this? This organism has been growing really rapidly in a few of our lakes. It actually kind of morphed into this like amorphous blob on the top right with another organism, and we poked at it and it was just flaking apart. So even like this anomalous orange blob with cyanobacteria. So again, just look out for these strange things on lakes. And then finally, this is one of my favorites because you can't see it usually. This is Cyanobacteria. You need to shine a special light on it for it to express its fluorescence back to you to really see it. But under like a normal microscope, you can probably see a little cluster and little dots. But when we shine a light on it, we can really get the fluorescent signal back and to confirm that it has the pigments associated with the cyanobacteria, helps us enumerate these classifications of the Cyanobacteria. They're just so tiny. They're the most numerous organism probably on the planet. They're in the oceans, they're in our lakes. We're just learning more about these, how they can become aerosolized, how toxic they might be, and how readily are they taken up through the aquatic food web, just because they're so tiny and they're more likely to end up in our food web. So through New Hampshire DES, we've identified 6 species that are more common, but are also more likely toxic. These are the planktotherids at the top left. This is actually what I'll be talking about later. This is more of what you're seeing in Danforth, is this top one. It grows deeper in the lake. It's something that we're trying to learn more about in New Hampshire lakes, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. This is that Warrenichinia, that orange bloom. We have Aphanosomina. This one is related to producing toxins like paralytic shellfish poisoning. We have Dolichospermum, Chrysosporum, and Microcystis. Microcystis is one of the more toxic ones. It produces that microcystin, the one that we know more about that causes the upset stomach. But we are seeing mostly Dolichospermum in New Hampshire lakes. And that one can produce that anatoxin, that nerve toxin that we've been talking about. So if you see anything strange or anomalous like I just showed you, please do call New Hampshire DES. It won't be me that you get, it will be Kate Hastings, who is a former UNH alum who also worked with Jim Haney. She's got a lot of knowledge on toxic cyanobacteria, did her work on aerosol toxicity, in fact. But please do call her, she's really nice. She can be reached at this phone number, you can see it, and this email. Basically what we do is collect samples, we identify and enumerate what's going on, and we also subsample because we can measure a few toxins, although not all of them, so that's what the state is trying to work on here. But we do issue advisories when cell count exceeds that 70,000 threshold. That is sort of arbitrary because, like I just said, each cyanobacteria is not the same. So one cell is not the same toxicity as another, but this threshold is sort of a precautionary guideline for the state. It's based on research from the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, also the World Health Organization, that once you start reaching around 100,000 cells per milliliter, you're at a higher risk of consuming this if you're swimming. And that's kind of what the recreational advisory is based on, is how likely is it that you're gonna swim and basically swallow a little bit, even a milliliter. Typically the town is notified, or if it's a private lake, maybe the owner, the lake association is notified. But if it is a public beach or a boat ramp, then we ask that signs are posted. There's usually a press release, it's posted on a map, and we try to get out through social media. But I would encourage you as a community to come up with your own chain of custody, or communication rather, so that you really have a clear chain of communication locally on when these events happen, maybe within the Ossipee Lake system. It's really important to reach out to the state and let them know how you want to be notified, and so that everyone, every little email or town site that you have could be notified.
What's the number?
It's 603-848-8094. And that email is HAB, as in harmful algal bloom, @des.nh.gov. And so again, advisories do not ever even really close a beach. That's up to the beach manager. It doesn't close a boat ramp. It's really just to inform you. It's saying, hey, look, be on the lookout. It might be totally clear at your house, and that's great, but someone that's in a cove might have a huge problem. And so the wind can blow and that can change, and that's actually an issue we've had at the state, is that if I drive like an hour and a half here and then, oh, the wind blew and it's not here, am I going to say, oh, it didn't happen, So that's where the Green Mountain Conservation Group has been an excellent assistance to us, formerly when I was at the state, to get samples, identify, just help that process go quicker. Because again, you might say, oh, it's gone, don't worry about it. Well, it's probably just gone from where you saw it, and it's going to probably linger for at least a week. That's what we find. In more recent years, we are seeing more blooms, or at least more have been reported. So we can say that that might be from public awareness, but we also know that some lakes that have been having blooms for years are getting worse. There's sometimes cycles where it's bad for 3 years and it's fine for 10. And that's really hard to understand as well. It could be in part due to how things are reported or cited. It's kind of like witnessing a tree fall in the woods, one of those things. And should we have an advisory if it's only just a little patch? I think that the advisory process just gets the communication out there, and then you start to realize like, oh, well, my neighbor saw it, and then they saw it, and no, it's still here. And it's just something for everyone to just be on alert, basically, for, so that you know what it is and stay away from it. So again, in more recent years, we've had this like uptick in advisory days. There was like another peak back in like 2008 and 9, and that could be weather related, or something that sparked the interest of the New Hampshire people at that time. But again, in more recent years, we're getting the strong trajectory of trending more advisories, more advisory days, and we don't have that many summer days in New Hampshire, so we don't like to see that. One example is Lock Lake last summer actually had this like pretty intense bloom at like all the beaches. There's several beaches on Lock Lake towards pretty much the whole month of August, and it was this combination of 3 different types of cyanobacteria that are typically the more common but also more toxic type. It was exceeding 50 million cells, so compare that to 70,000. This could be very potent if you even just got some on your finger and rubbed your eye. You could have some irritations just from that alone. So again, just seeing it, recognizing it, and staying away from it is what you should do and report it. But this lake actually has been monitored for some time with the Volunteer Lakes Assessment Program, so we already know a lot about this lake and that the water quality is decreasing. It's worsening over the years. This report's from 2019, and that was the last year that Lock Lake actually monitored with the VLAP program. But when you look at the Volunteer Lakes Assessment reports on the DES website, there's sort of like this report card, basically. You guys have one with some of your other ponds here. But you can start to see that these other parameters are also going into more of a worsening condition. And this process is called eutrophication. Basically, all of our lakes are heading towards this eutrophication process, but we can do little things to kind of slow this process down. And we all want to live on lakes. I do. I don't live on a lake, but I would love to someday. And you have to consider, that the more development, the less of the plants that are going to soak up the rain, if you will, there will be. And so we all have to kind of be mindful and do our part on our shorelines. But there's a lot more to it, of course, and so having a lake in a monitored program is really important because we can start to track the health of the lake over time. And sometimes these parameters are listed as impairments with the state, and that doesn't sound great. You're like, we're impaired for this and that, but down the road, this sort of documentation and this sort of data collection can actually be useful for the state and the federal government for future funding of remediation and help in the future. So it's good to have this record even though it's not a great report card. What Lock Lake also started to do is they decided they were going to drink the lake. It's coming out of Lock Lake into the Webster Stream, and so New Hampshire DES is making them monitor very carefully for cyanobacteria because it's coming from Lock Lake to the Webster Stream. So they've got this really sophisticated device, I would consider this multi-parameter probe to measure the pigments of cyanobacteria that are coming over the dam into the stream. And so you can see that just even within like a month period, there's a cyclical sort of abundance of cyanobacteria. Again, it's growing in the lake, it's coming up to the surface, and then it might get thrown over the dam down to the stream. But it's a continuous cycle. It can have good days and bad days. It's going to grow really well under certain conditions, and then it might calm down under others. So knowing that this can cyclically change is also important. There's also this really interesting study by Sabina Perkis, who was with UNH. Her master's was on looking at these deep layer blooms of cyanobacteria. Actually have the wrong picture. That's not a metalimnetic layer. That's a different organism. But this is an oscillatoria or a planktothrix bloom that you've also been seeing in the Danforth ponds. And when she sent that probe that I just showed you down into the vertical profile of the lake over time, on these 3 lakes that also have this bloom down there, you can see where the pigment signal is just increasing. Like here we have like around 5 meters, we have this little blue blip. Right here, there's a blue blip. Right here, there's a blue one. So this is an indication using that tool that there's a bloom down there. And this type likes to live down there. It likes to regulate its buoyancy. It might be benefiting from nutrients below and sunlight above. So it's kind of at a good layer where it can just really grow and take off. So lower Danforth. This is what we have more information on in regard to the Danforth ponds. Lower Danforth is part of VLAP. They changed their reporting format, so don't be surprised if you go and look and you're like, that doesn't look like the VLAP report, but they have a little table that kind of shows the major parameters and what trend is going on, and it looks like things are stable, improving. Conductivity was worsening. Conductivity is sort of a measure of salts and pollution getting into the lake. It can mean a lot of things though. So I kind of blew up this like bottom graph series here, and I don't know that you can see it all that well, but with Sarah Steiner, she's the VLAP program coordinator. She works with Green Mountain Conservation as well. We collected DO profiles and could see that, this is probably hard to see, but in July, the dissolved oxygen, there is a blip right here. It goes straight and then it kind of goes more positive and then it comes down. And then there's like no oxygen basically down here. This little oxygen layer right here is probably that Planktothrix. I'm just guessing, I haven't like looked at that layer, but when you are monitoring these lakes, these oxygen profiles can be telling of where there might be algal activity deeper in the lake. But what's also concerning is that when it does truly go anoxic, and this green one is from September over here, actually there's May and September over here. Not having oxygen at the bottom of the lake is a growing problem throughout New Hampshire, probably globally. But when we have no oxygen at the bottom, it's not just bad for fish, it's actually going to create a chemical reaction that allows more nutrients from the bottom to become biologically available. So in the lower Danforth system, we're seeing that there is probably an oxygen problem at the bottom that is helping more nutrients come up and feed cyanobacteria. And I'm just guessing because of that oxygen bloom that could also be a slight little bloom of the Planktothrix that we see accumulate in middle Danforth and the Danforth Bay. We don't have this level of information for that section of the lake quite yet. The thing that's really important is this top table here. So epilimion is that top really well mixed layer of the lake. It's usually warmer. We have the metalimion. This is where the temperature gradually changes in the middle of the lake, and that's where we're seeing this oscillatory or Planktothrix bloom. And then the hypolimion is the bottom, and this is usually defined by a cooler temperature and low dissolved oxygen. And down there, the phosphorus is higher. That's not uncommon, but it's important when you look at the assessment of nutrients that you're not just looking at the top water, where 10 is a pretty good value. It's sort of borderline of the level that you want to be at. But 35 is telling that there's nutrients at the bottom of the lake that are probably helping this bloom along. Oh, also what Sarah does is she looks at organisms, and so this is a bar graph that just shows that purple there is the group of Cyanobacteria. I don't know what she identified the Cyanobacteria as from this assessment, but you can see the purple kind of grew in 2021. So what I could find from Middle Danforth was an old assessment from 1983. I was probably just a few months old. No, I wasn't born yet. But if you go to the New Hampshire DES Lake Info Mapper, you can select any of the lakes that you want and look at any data that New Hampshire DES has on this. It will include lake state monitoring reports too. However, the only thing I could really find was this 1983 trophic survey report. There's probably more information because I know that Sarah did an assessment with Craig and Green Mountain probably last year or the year before. But for what was available, what I thought was interesting, sorry this is cut off, but you have the depth of the lake, you have the temperature of the lake in August, and look at this oxygen.
You have a little spike in oxygen here at 4 meters. And so even back in '83, there was like this little oxygen thing going on that I feel could have been the plankton fix, but I don't know. So we need to monitor this lake, and that's why Green Mountain is monitoring the Danforth pond system now, the middle, of course, which you'd think is part of the lower, but it's very different, perhaps, we don't know. And New Hampshire, University of New Hampshire Lake Slate Monitoring Program is going to help process those samples. What we do know of Middle Danforth or the Danforth Bay is that, again, I put the wrong picture here, this is not it. Sorry, this is not it, but you see these little green flakes. Doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but these clumps represent millions and millions of cells. And I actually grabbed a sample that looked like that and put it in a beaker. If you can see, there's just like a lot of tiny little filaments in there. They kind of break apart, and it might look like the water is clear, but there's some tiny little hair-like filaments in the water that you just probably wouldn't see unless it was clumped like that. So it's just indicative of the situation here, that this stuff comes up and then kind of clumps together. We also kind of observed it like a lava lamp kind of situation. I'm sorry, I'm probably way over on time, and I'll finish up here. How much time do we have? Oh, okay. Okay, so real quick, just another sighting at the Danforth Bay area was Dilithiosperma. Green Mountain helped identify this. It was just a little patch that we observed, but you know, again, even this might not show that the whole lake is blooming and it's terrible, but you just want people to know to stay away from that type of stuff. That's that Dilithiosperma that can produce the antitoxin. So what can you do? You know, it can be daunting talking about cyanobacteria, but it's really just this one parameter that is telling of water quality. It's just telling us that, you know, excess nutrients are getting in to feed this stuff just like we feed our plants. So one organization that I think is pretty useful, I've been a part of this Cyanobacteria Monitoring Cooperative. This is hosted by the EPA, mostly Region 1, but it's really expanded almost globally, but definitely across the United States. This is more of a citizen approach to monitoring, and DES and UNH can help assist with this approach. There are some issues with it, so I won't be totally endorsing it, but it's coming along, and basically we just want people to be volunteering to help, you know, to be on Bloom Watch and report your sightings. That's something that everyone can do once you start to see it and know what it is. You know, let your neighbor know, hey, keep your dog out of there. Cyano monitoring is also just a regional effort to use this device, a fluorometer like the one I showed you, but a simplified version of that. It's like a little handheld device that we have that we can help monitor the pigments associated with cyanobacteria. At the Lake Slate Monitoring Lab, we're trying to use this tool more readily, but we're still evaluating how well it's working for us. It doesn't tend to be that sensitive, but when you do have a bloom, it's you know, confirming what you have. And then finally there's Cyanoscope, and that's for the really interested volunteer who wants to get a microscope and say, no, it's pollen, it's not cyanobacterial, let's not like call everybody about it quite yet, because then you might have, you know, a local expert that can just identify it for you. And that's also something that I think anyone could really do. We have these nice like image gallery keys to help you along, but it's also just fun. You'll see non-cyanobacteria. There's a lot of really interesting organisms in the lake. It might freak you out. It might be fascinating. We have plants, animals, bacteria, all these little tiny things that we swim with that we can't see. And getting a microscope can really be telling of what you have. Of course, there's a lot of taxonomic and image-based keys out there. This is just a whole bunch of information here, but I wanted to just point out that there are some services out there that will process samples for toxins. There's nice little image galleries that kind of tell you about differences in what type of bloom you're seeing. There's also this new-ish guide. It's the strategies for preventing and managing harmful cyanobacteria blooms. This was it's from the Interstate Regional Council that created the HAB group. Basically, all of the major states and regulators of lakes and beaches got together and created this document on cyanobacteria. I was involved with this, and it's a really great guide just to learn more about cyanobacteria. It kind of goes through case studies where certain lakes have had treatment, what worked, what didn't.
That whole category, I won't get into all of the different types of treatment there are out there, but there's a lot of, if you do a Google search, don't believe everything you see. Some things work because it was in a controlled lab, some things work because of the lake that it was in. So, it's easy to say, oh, well, this worked here. It doesn't mean it's always gonna work, depending on the lake, the type of cyanobacteria you have. There's a whole bunch of stuff involved with managing, but this document really reviews that well. And finally, I just want to point you back locally to the Green Mountain Conservation Group. Really has all the resources. He's checking it out more recently. There's a whole thing about best management practices and videos for you guys to see, but also just wanted to point you to the Lake Watershed Management Plan, which I think was done in 2015 or initially and has been updated in 2018. But this really encompasses the whole Ossipee Lake system and then focuses on the sub-watersheds of Danforth, for example. And so I encourage you to get to the website. We know the types of cyanobacteria that are present and the potential issues. We can identify and remediate these external sources that are contributing to nutrients in these ponds. So definitely review the watershed management plan because it will outline very specific roadways and stormwater issues and other problems that you should be considering locally. One part that's interesting is if you skip to the appendices, you can actually see the Danforth ponds in the lower bay system, the direct loads to the Danforth ponds. And what's interesting is that this watershed load, which is the external nutrients, was thought to be 99% of the total phosphorus, or in this case maybe 88%. However, we need to know more about the middle Danforth pond system and identify this sub-watershed that is very large, in fact, that is affecting the Danforth ponds directly. So while you should check your septic, you should check your own lawns, there's something external that's really huge contributing to the nutrient load that could just be historical. Could be logging events that happened years ago. It could be agriculture that happened years ago. Could just be big storm events that are really bringing in something. So really pay attention to the external stuff because that is where you really need to start. And it's great that you already have a watershed management plan. So yes, and the phase 2 was released in January 2018. Again, you can get this from Green Mountain, but it's really a great collaboration of Green Mountain, FB Environmental, and DES's work. They know more about the plan than I do, so please do review this and ask questions because it's not simple, it is daunting, but again, consider the stormwater runoff, just things that you can address in your own area. That's a very good start, and consider being a Lake Smart guide. And if anything, just read this introduction by the FB Environmental on the background and purpose of this project. I think it's a really great resource. And sorry, I did go over, but you can email me. I'm still kind of getting set up. I don't have a direct phone number quite yet. I'm working that out, but you can email me at this point. And I just wanted to point out our website, the Lakeside Monitoring Program, and what we do. And Cooperative Extension alone, just wanted to thank the volunteers because just collaboratively, this doesn't encompass just lakes, it encompasses all the volunteers in New Hampshire that work with Cooperative Extension, but just thousands of hours going in to help us understand our natural resources. And we really rely on volunteers and groups like Green Mountain and the Friends of Danforth Pond. So thank you guys very much for listening to probably what was long-winded cyanobacteria time, but I'd be happy to take any questions at this time. Thank you.
So are there any questions?
I have a question.
You have a question? Okay.
Over the years, I think we've had cyanobacteria in Danforth Pond for the past, maybe 4 or 5 years. Does the state keep a list or a track of what types of blooms we've had for the past, and where can we get that?
Yes, I would reach out to Kate because it's not something you can find on the environmental monitoring database quite yet, which is a source of data for the state. So it is kind of tied up with the program coordinator right now, but she'd be happy to share that with you.
I can say that from what I recall, it's been this deep layer, Cyanobacteria, the Planktothrix, that again might have been down there for years, and that is just starting to come up, and that could be due to lots of things related to the climate, but also nutrients. So definitely Planktothrix, and then occasionally the Stilichospermum, which is very common, again, probably the most reported one we have across the state. It tends to be more of an issue in June. It's kind of like this ephemeral kind of thing, I guess, but it can persist longer, and we've seen it all the way into August in the Danforth ponds. So those are really the two that I know of that seem to be a problem in that area.
So an advisory is only listed or issued if it exceeds 70,000
Yes.
gallons?
Yes. Yeah. We're also entertaining this idea of alerts, which is not an official advisory, but say we get a photo, we're like, well, that's a bloom, but we take hours to get here, and it's like, oh, we can't really see it anymore, but then we drive away and someone calls and says, oh no, it's over here. So these alerts have also been useful, just it's not an official advisory, it wouldn't be like on the map basically as of yet. They're working on their program and how they might be sharing that information, but there's also just like a small alert process that could just be based on a photo. Doesn't really go much further than sharing it locally.
Amanda, the watershed management plans that you referenced seem to me to be very well done, comprehensive, talks about runoff, talks about septic systems, talks about all these things. But your recommendation would be to attack and implement these recommendations, I guess, right?
Yes, and I would say you want to do it sooner than later. I mean, I wouldn't say this is an old watershed management plan, it's still relevant, especially if in the future you're trying to get funding that could help remediate an issue. New Hampshire is starting to look at treatments again after probably 30 or more years of not doing treatment. Other states do use certain types of treatment, like algicides. They can sometimes make the problem worse. It's something you have to continue to use, and you have to be prepared to pay for that. So New Hampshire hasn't really aggressively gone that route. But last summer at Nippo Pond in Barrington, after a watershed management plan, after monitoring and determining that the internal load of nutrients was a significant fraction of the total load of nutrients, which could be the case in the Danforth ponds, that they actually qualified to get an alum treatment. It's aluminum type of treatment that makes the phosphorus biologically unavailable internally, but you really have to do the hard work of addressing the external issues first. The state won't do anything if the BMPs haven't been checked off the list. So there should be very specific recommendations in the plan on what to address, but down the road that can really set you up for probably some funding in some form. It's usually not totally free, it's usually a matching fund of some type, so the town does have to also be involved in those decisions and raising money, of course, but that treatment can last for like 25 years. It falls into the lake, it binds the phosphorus at the bottom, and then makes it biologically unavailable for some time. Now some lakes though, and we don't know this to be the case in Danforth, already naturally have a lot of aluminum in the soil, which could mean that it's really not an internal problem. And so far the evidence suggests that really the external stuff is what you should focus on. It's probably the easiest, cheapest thing to focus on first. It's just hard, it's hard to get everybody to do their part.
Well, it may be a part of the human condition, but when you try to, get people engaged, you hear about things like, it's gonna cost me, I can't do that.
Yeah.
There's some anger sometimes involved. Have you seen that?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I get it, I totally understand, and I agree. I think it's, it's like we're all sharing this backyard, this resource, and you think, oh, it's not my problem, I didn't do anything, my lawn is perfect, but even just the outreach and just coming together as a community, like the Friends of Danforth Pond, is a great start. You get to increase the public awareness, but I understand it's daunting and it's very difficult. But I think if you put in the work, which you have a watershed management plan, you have a great local organization helping, and you have a group coming together, these are all the right steps to be taking to get the financial assistance in the future And again, I don't know the trajectory of what these ponds will need, but the alum treatment can be very successful and really clear things up. The last real success story was, I think Kezar Lake in Sutton, but again, there's other, and that was in like the early 80s, I think. But they also addressed that they had a wastewater issue that they addressed first. They fixed some things in the watershed, and then they had this alum treatment, and it's been a success.
So we're not a candidate right now for that?
I think that you are. I
We
think
are?
you need to contact the state and talk about what you've done so far, though, because you do have a plan, you do have a group, you do have the interest, and those are the steps you need to get started, absolutely. So speaking with New Hampshire DES, like Steve Landry or Jeff Marcoux and that group will help you understand the process, and I can't explain that right now, because I'm not sure what DES will or will not allow. Again, since Kezar, which I think was actually 1979 that they did that. Nippo Pond is the last example, and they just did that last summer. And that's a smaller pond, but it's also, they addressed a lot of major issues first, which already actually helped the pond, I think, before they even did the treatment. So it's looking good, but it's very fresh and new, and so we gotta see how well this is working. Yes?
Could the years of chemical treatment of milfoil be a factor?
It's a very good question, and so I have to say, I don't know for sure, but to me, and I've spoke with others, you know, whenever you have like a mass die-off of organic matter, if you were chemically treating all these plants, they die off, they're releasing nutrients, so you could be contributing to the nutrient load. I don't know that it would be long lasting, but if you're doing it several years in a row, it could contribute enough to spark a bloom, that we do see that sometimes. See, the macrophytes are bad, we want to control them, but it's a delicate balance, because once you remove them, you're creating a void for cyanobacteria to come in, because there's more light, there's more nutrients, so that can happen. It's not well documented, so I don't want to say, oh yeah, we have all the facts on it, but I suspect that there's a relationship. It's just, I don't know how long lasting those events can be. I will also say, you know, when we have big rain events, sometimes it is just, it's quick. It's just, oh, well, there was a bloom, there was, you know, there's already cyanobacteria in the water. It's not like, oh, it just magically appeared. It's there. It's just how much is it gonna grow? It's part of all these other, you know, groups of phytoplankton naturally. It just tends to do better than others and grows very rapidly. So even after storms, we might see, well, something definitely carried a surge of nutrients in, followed by a hot sunny day. Again, it's like the perfect recipe for that. So killing off plants could probably also quickly spark that, but I don't know that it would last very long.
Amanda, your presentation, another question?
Question for Amanda, notification, so Danforth's only got like 75 property owners. Half of them are part-time or a good deal are part-time. And it's sort of like you said, the wind can blow, because the campground, Danforth Bay, is doing a visual every day, but a lot of times the wind blows over. So I'm interested in hearing what you know about this program where possibly notifications, because they call, some people call, but it's always inconsistent to try to understand when it's out there unless you're out looking.
Well, exactly. Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, you might not even notice it, but it could be accumulated to high levels at someone else's shore. So it's not to say that, you know, the whole lake is in trouble. It's just that it's more of like a warning. You know, the wind could blow and shove it into your cove. So it's really up to anyone who sees it to report it.
But I'm back to this program, so if we could tell people that are on the east side, because the wind's coming out of the west, sometimes you see it on the east.
Yeah.
If the people knew someplace to call and this may turn into a program that gets developed, we were talking about.
Well, yeah, so New Hampshire DES did just create this harmful algal bloom program. I was partially involved in the start of that. I was with the beach program, and then we created the Cyanobacterial bloom program because it did become a necessity. The public was really needing somebody to come and look and respond. Which is why, again, like Green Mountain has helped a lot, because if certain days the state might get 12 calls from different locations in the state, we have to prioritize like How quickly can we get there? How bad is it? So that was just me, and now it's just Kate. And and I was doing the beach program, but they have someone for the beach program now. So really, we do rely on people who live there to spread the word. Some lakes don't report it. They just decide that they're not going to report it, and we don't hear about it, or the state doesn't hear about it. And so that's again the Friends of Danforth, Green Mountain, these groups that can really create the awareness around it is important, so that you can report it. And again, we don't want to make a big deal of every little patch that we see, but it's just good to communicate with your neighbors and to inform people when they're not sure about it. But that number and that email is a good start to just report it. Whether it becomes an advisory or not, it's a good record for the state to have, just so we know about it, but it doesn't always become an advisory. And that's probably good that it doesn't always become an advisory. It's more of a public awareness issue. Yes?
Hi there. Nice presentation, thank you.
Thank you.
Last summer I noticed through August and September, the pond was full of green blue specks everywhere. It was just like glittering with it. And I couldn't let my dog go in at all, which is a really big concern. She's my baby. But
Yeah.
I would talk to the campground a lot and walk over there. But I would think, what's the onus on the campground? That's their business, is that pond. And how can they be involved better? So can we have a flag system? Like when you go to the ocean and it's rough, when they have a flag out.
Yeah.
Some sort of thing like that people can look at and see a flag, the post,
It's a good idea. Yeah, I wouldn't put it all on the campground to do the messaging, but
I'm just curious what they're being held accountable for as far as runoff goes.
Oh, yeah. From what I understand, they've addressed a lot of the BMPs that need to be addressed, and maybe more so than most, and they have a lot of property there, of course. So I think that they're probably a good example to look to on what to do, because they've experienced it. Totally. And they inform the community, when there is an accumulation at the beach. They have a pool, which is great too, so I think campers have an alternative, but you can also just take a boat out to the middle and maybe not experience the flex, but it is more of a concern for dogs, so I understand your concern. Trying to, prevent a dog from drinking the lake water is probably impossible. Washing them off really well after is also important, because they can get more, their fur kind of acts like a concentrator in a way, because it all kind of sieves onto their fur and then they groom themselves. But I understand your concern, and I think that's where, as a community, just coming up with a communication process would be really helpful for the state, because we don't know how to alert everybody. Whether we have the map, we have a press release, social media, but not everyone sees that, or not everyone knows to look at the map, and it might be happening before the state knows or doesn't know at all. So,
well, maybe we could set a schedule up for people who are there, like this week I'll be on duty, next week you be on duty, and find a place to put a flag or two.
yeah, flag.
Network like
Yeah.
that, so that there's always somebody on duty to keep an eye on it and just volunteer to do that if they want to.
I think that's great.
And then as far as the landscaping goes, over the years, I've been taking the stones that are right in your yard to make the runoff in the tier system. But I'm afraid of erosion. I want to save my land.
Yeah, erosion's a big problem.
And,
Yeah.
And protect it, so,
Yeah.
and then, periodically I'll go get plants on sale that are, I went to that, site, the college website,
Mm-hmm.
and looked up the plants that are from the area, and what deer will eat, and, did the things that it said, and it's work, like physical work.
It
And
is.
then I went to the aggregate for the stone, because it's from here, and, didn't buy it at another place, I went there to get it, because it's from here, so. Those things that are little by little, they help, and they help prevent the erosion of the property.
Yeah.
Swampiness and mosquitoes and all those other things.
Oh yeah, I'm glad you mentioned erosion, because I didn't really say much about that, but I think it's very steep around Danforth too, and that's another thing to consider, is just how to prevent the erosion, and that is a contributing nutrient
And if you have
factor.
a steep driveway, you can't use it in the winter, you don't want it getting steeper.
Right, you have to be safe too, so salt and sand is a delicate balance, yeah. But no, I like your idea about a flag, you know, and it's up to you guys locally to create a signage, you know,
Yeah.
locally. Again,
I
like
think that's a
we,
good idea, or have a host house like the volunteering,
Yeah.
have a flag outside of your yard for that
Yeah.
week. It's
Yeah.
really
Excuse me a
Yeah.
minute, just because I don't know if people know.
Yeah.
So, the campground does a visual inspection almost every day.
yes, I know
And
that,
then if
yeah.
they see the specs, I know they notify you guys, but if they feel it's significant, they actually put about every 100 feet, these little 2.5 foot stakes with an orange sign.
Yeah.
So if you're anywhere near the campground, if you're on Middle, all you have to do, is they usually stick out in the little cove past the marina, you can actually see them on the, against the green, you'll see the orange, so at least if you're on Middle and you look over, you can see there's, when they feel the signs are up, because the only time they put the signs out are for the notification when we do the milfoil treatment, and they do it also for the notification that they've seen evidence that it's in the water along their shore.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the campground, they, you know, even found some really great signs from New York that I don't think New Hampshire really has the greatest resources right now for signage. So we're working on that as well to have more of an infographic, like an outreach that really educates people rather than it's like advisory, stay out of the water. I don't think that's the right message either, but just to inform people that, you know, we're not closing things down, but we know what it looks like and that you can recognize the blue-green flecks is important. You know, that stuff is the cyanobacteria. Those little clumps do represent large numbers. When you can see it, it's concentrated, it's high, yeah.
Hi, Amanda. I was wondering if either you or people who live on Danforth or Green Mountain maybe could clarify the nomenclature for Danforth. I mean, way back in the day when I was young, it was Danforth Pond was the whole area.
Yeah.
And then there was lower, middle, upper, and Huckins Pond.
Yeah.
And now it's very confusing to a lot of people as
Sure,
to
yeah.
what area is which. So
Yeah,
I was currently
So I messed up, I think the first advisory I issued, I called it Danforth Bay. I later learned it was Middle Danforth, and officially with the state, it's considered Middle Danforth and lower. I think they consider Huckins upper. I think with the state, that's what it is. But, you know, I would say a lot of New Hampshire lakes have multiple names that are, there's an old name and then people kind of just stick with it. So I think officially we could call it Middle Danforth. I sometimes add Bay to clarify that piece.
The middle refers to the
Just in front of, just in
Closer
front
to
of
the campground.
Right,
Yeah.
okay, and then the lower is the narrow.
Right before
Yeah.
the bridge, right before the bridge.
Yeah,
Mhm.
okay, and then
Yeah.
Huckins Pond
Is
is.
that,
Yeah, okay.
And then the town refers to the channel as Danforth River on all their maps, but the state and the federal call it the Stony Brook.
Yeah.
And the Stony Brook actually starts up by Purity Springs.
Not New Hampshire. Yeah, no, that's a good point. And to me, I look at lower and middle, and I'm like, I think it's the same thing. But you know, I get it that it's different. There's different basins. But you know, it would be interesting after monitoring middle, where you know that Danforth Bay area more, if how well it matches lower Danforth. There are two different basins. They can behave differently. I firsthand visually saw like the lava lamp accumulation in the middle section coming from the deep site, and we did do a profile and saw that little oxygen spike, and went down and grabbed a sample, and it was like pure blue-green color. It was a deep bloom. So you know, again, it might always have been there. We're not sure, but now that we know it's there, it comes up periodically. It's becoming a nuisance. And I will just point out again, Sabina Perkins, her thesis, when she looked at multiple lakes that had this deep layer bloom, at least for the microcystin toxin, we're finding that the type we're seeing in New Hampshire produces a very low toxin of microcystin. We just don't know about the other toxins like anatoxin and some of the other ones that I think are a little more scary in a way because of how fast acting they can be. But again, it's more of a consumption issue. If you're That's why I always talk about dogs. I don't think that too many people are going to swallow enough water to become very ill, but it's happened. I know it has. So again, it's just something to be aware of, and I think just letting your neighbors know is important, and spreading the awareness, because it's not likely going away anytime soon. But there can be times where you just see it for 3 years, and it corresponds with the climate sometimes, and then it's really virtually gone for
for another 10. And we see lakes that become impaired, they get impaired for like a 10-year cycle. And you see that, well, the last time they had a bloom was like 10 years ago, and they might almost be off the impairment list because there's been nothing reported since. That could be in part due to who lives there and who's reporting it. But then we see it pop up again. And so it's cyclical. So it's something to just be aware of, and definitely, notice those flecks. Those are the cyanobacteria. Yes?
Quick question. Our well draws water from the middle.
Yeah.
Danforth. We avoid drinking it, but we bathe in it and do our dishes and laundry and so forth. What is the risk?
Yeah, I don't know a lot about how well the toxins can move through into a well. The microcystin is one of the more stable toxins and the more well-researched toxin. So that one can last in the water for weeks, and can be an extracellular toxin, meaning it's just like a free chemical. So if there is enough of it, it could get into the well, but I imagine at pretty low levels. It's not bad if you have a well for drinking, as long as it's being treated properly. I wouldn't draw from the lake directly to drink the water, but I think that the natural sand filtration at least gets rid of more of the cellular content. But again, there can be low levels of the microcystin, as far as we know, because it's a very stable toxin. So even after it's been released from the cell, it can still be persistent in the water for some time after, but typically at levels that are low enough that it wouldn't cause harm immediately. We don't know a lot about chronic toxicity, though. I will say in China, there's been some studies more on the epidemiology of these microcystis types of blooms, and microcystin, the toxin, and liver cancer. And so, the more chronic effects is probably scarier, the neurological effects, all of that acutely we don't understand, but chronically we really don't understand. And it can be your genetics, it could be what you eat. There's a lot of factors contributing to these illnesses. But I wouldn't be terribly concerned about this getting into your well, but know that low-level toxins can permeate through sand filtration and most filtration and treatment. So it is possible, but yeah.
A question across the state now, do they do many studies with the aquatic plants in the water versus these blooms? Like lakes that have the blooms, are they have less aquatic plants or more in them? And the reason I say that is, ironically, a person spoke to me and said, oh yeah, I was on the lake when I was young. The problem over there is they gotta run some motorboats and get rid of all those lily pads and weeds and stuff. And I was like, what? It was like no clue of the whole composition. Is the state looking at that in terms of those that have more aquatic plant or less of it has an impact?
Well, I will say I don't think that they're directly looking at that as a study. However, New Hampshire did pass a House bill on having a Cyanobacteria study commission, so it's likely that some of these topics will come up soon. And so the state will be addressing how to study cyanobacteria rather than just monitor in a way or react. But it's a good question, and even myself, I don't know the answer. I think, again, each lake is so unique, and where the water comes is really important, but there could be a correlation with even just treating weeds and having these short stint blooms that we're sort of seeing, but we can't say for certain. So it's a good point, and it's probably a good avenue to look at, for sure. Yes? Sure, yeah.
I have another question. So when the wind blows, certain coves get a lot of the drifted wood and all the leaves and all the junk, and it just accumulates in certain areas. But over years it sits there and it becomes petrified and it turns into muck. So when I was reading, you're not supposed to disturb the plant life, but it's not necessarily the plant life. Does that smother out the plant life and make the water less healthy in areas where it becomes muck and just piles and piles of sticks and leaves and pine needles? Should you try to clean some of that out and bring it to the dump, or is it bad to touch that?
Yeah, I mean, really, you're not supposed to really remove things. What can happen is, I mean, we have, leaves happen, and you don't want to dump extra leaves, or you don't want to dump extra yard waste, but what naturally falls and what naturally happens is fine to leave alone. What you can end up doing if you disturb that is actually kind of bringing up more nutrients into the water column.
But I think more concerning is habitat, and that's why you're really not supposed to mess with it. But I would say, you know, if it's your own shoreline and you're seeing like floating debris, it's okay to clean that out, clean your beach area. Yeah, it's just when these huge trees fall, it's hard. You gotta talk to the state on what they would allow and not allow for that. Yeah. And you just want to be careful in these accumulations. Sometimes it's cyanobacteria, sometimes it's something else that you just treat it as a potentially harmful thing because of the toxicity and some other things, like parasites, like I mentioned. There's a lot of crazy things in the water that we don't even know about, really, you know. So it's just something to, you know, treat gently, and you can break it out. I wouldn't put this stuff like directly on your garden, but it can compost really well. So if you use the compost system and you get to it next year, that's better to use the soil than directly putting it on your fruit and vegetables, because the accumulation is possible for toxicity.
I was under the impression that we had a lot of natural springs on Danforth.
I don't know. I've heard that too, and I don't like personally know how many or where they are. Does anyone know about natural springs in the Danforth pond? Oh, hi, Craig.
There is spring activity over near the Cove Beach, sort of a point right near where the river goes up to Upper Danforth. There's 2 or 3 springs there. If you look in the wintertime, it never freezes.
Yeah.
And it's, you walk around in the summer, you can feel the cold water on your feet.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't really know about other places, but, and it's very stony. It's kind of the bottom of the lake is more, it's baseball size stones in there where the water kind of trickles out of the ground.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. So the flow of water is important, and knowing that there's springs is beneficial too. So, you know, I would say just because this is happening now doesn't mean it's always going to be happening. And again, I've seen examples where people have addressed some just very simple external issues and it's fixed the problem. And I could even say that about Nippo Pond, but they got the added, you know, treatment more recently. But, you know, I think it seems like, oh, what I do is not going to matter. Like, it's kind of like climate change. You're like, oh, what I do is not going to matter. But there are these little, like, holes in the boat, if you will, that you can plug up to kind of slow things down, and it can help. It can really help. So.
Well, Amanda, just an absolutely excellent presentation. Amanda came all the way from Manchester. You're very kind.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great to hear.